remind people that these planes are really this cool, and we don't fly them to events like this and put them out there so people can see them. It's really easy to forget how much it meant to the world what happened 75 years ago.
So twice now, there's been the second lady today, but they've never seen a finished product. My first privilege was Mary, 4 years ago maybe, and I took her up in the airplane, and I took her for a flight in the air. And it was my honor and privilege to do that. And my honor and privilege to take this young lady up today. So thank you for what all of you did. I really appreciate it.
So this is Mayor John McTaggart of Edwardsville. His friends call him Tiny. Don't know why, but I'll let him talk to it.
Dan, thank you very much for inviting me over. Like Dan said, my name is John McTaggart. I am also the mayor of Edwardsville and the president of the Wyandotte County Historical Society and Museum. And recently we honored Dan and you folks here that are some of the original builders. We recognized you with a special award for the Wyandotte County Historical Society. And it was a pleasure doing that because it's such a pleasure working with someone with a passion about this that Dan has. And so it was really an honor for me to be able to award you this award for your work during the war. And I will read it. Incidentally, it's called the Margaret Landis Award, and it is given to groups and individuals who have done exemplary work and dedication and service for preserving history for Wyandotte County. Their work on the home front to protect American citizens during World War II. The North American Aviation Kansas plant was in production from December of 1941 until August 1945. During that time, 59,337 men and women employed at NAAK built 6,608 B-25 Mitchell bombers. The first Kansas-built B-25 was completed the 23rd December 1941, just 16 days after the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. The B-25 bomber planes served throughout World War II. Anyway, thank you very much, and it was an honor being here.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. And you see the history there all the way up through June 16th, 1942. That reserve base was transferred here to what is now the New Century Airport. So that's the connection that they serve. So basically, this area was a training facility during the war. This training facility started down at Fairfax. They moved because they built this little plant right next door, and they needed a little bit of room for these B-25s. Technically termed Project A41, December 7th, 1940. For those astute at math, that's exactly 1 year prior to Pearl Harbor. They announced they were going to build a plant. It would be owned by the federal government, but operated by a small little company called North American Aviation. They were going to build B-25s here. I shouldn't say it that way. They were going to assemble B-25s here. Kansas City actually purchased the airport. The government owned the land and the building that the plant was built on next door. This is what the plant would eventually look like. That's after the expansion we'll talk about here in a second. There was no windows, no doors. It was both air-conditioned and heated. I mention that because at the time it was the largest building in the United States that was both heated and air-conditioned. That was extremely unusual. There were no windows. All of the doors actually were covered so that if you opened up a door, you couldn't see the light when you were surrounding it. It technically was not camouflaged like many of the plants were during the war. But if you look at the roof structure up here, you notice it looks an awful lot like a parking lot. As it turns out, if you're flying over 500 feet, it looks exactly like a parking lot. So that basically said it's hard to find from the air. Obviously, you're going to be bombing at higher than 500 feet, so if you wanted to bomb it, you couldn't see it. So no camouflage was needed. This is a picture that was taken early on. I won't read through all this stuff, but there was several architects, several construction companies that were working with it. Muskogee Iron Works, for example, built all of the steel and so on and so forth. But most of the work, most of the labor was provided by the Army Corps of Engineers. This is an interesting picture. This is the official groundbreaking picture. Do you guys recognize anybody in that picture? Yeah, neither did anybody else. So the photographer said, hey, we need to fix that. So this is the picture that hit the newspaper the next day. So on your left over there is the mayor, Payne Ratner. In the middle is Major Nielsen. And on the right, of course, is J.H. Kindleberger, who he was running North American at the time. And most importantly, you have the cute little kid in the center. That's what sells newspapers, right? Here's the interesting thing. How many people are familiar with Fairfax, have driven down there many, many, many times? The interesting thing that the people will notice is that's Kindleberger Road. What you drive on now is Kindleberger Road. Somewhere along the way, they misspelled Kindleberger's name. I don't know why, but whatever. But it is Kindleberger Road, and that's when it was signed. And that was on March 8, 1941, is when it was designated as Kindleberger Road. This is what the plant looked like, literally March 11th. So March 8th, we have 3 shovels in the ground. Literally 3 days later on March 11th, we're leveling the place. They were serious about building this. You have to remember, it was a floodplain before then. Most of it was landfill, so it's all, basically there's nothing really stable to build on. So they built piers. Basically, they dug these big holes in the ground, filled them full of concrete, poured a foundation over top of it. This is them kind of leveling off on March 11th. Let's move forward to April. Amazingly enough, they got a lot of work done in a month. That picture is a little bit later than April, but they started putting the steel up on April 7th, so less than a month away. In July, they had finished all the structural steel. It looked pretty much like this picture here. And this picture was actually taken the first part of September, and it was taken for an article that ran on September 7th, so it would have been taken probably about the first or second day of September. It was reported in the newspaper at that time as being 90% complete. It's interesting that they say it that way, because if you work there at the plant at this time, you will know that September 1941, it didn't have the big north doors. North, winter, not a good thing coming. But they called it 90% complete. Now, I'm going to talk about the first employees just for a second. You'll say, wait a minute, that's not a flat roof. You're right, that's Inglewood. The first 53 employees for the plant came from the Inglewood factory in California. Basically, the factory manager, division engineer, and production manager, those 3 names there, all 3 came from the factory, along with 50 employees. Now, I've kind of grouped them by group here because writing up 50 names, you'd get bored. But we do have the names of all 50 of those employees. But we had 8 educators that went to be the first instructors in the National Defense Training School, with every one of you went through, that built the plane. They had 28 supervisors, 14 just general employees, and they were all here by the middle of July. So that's kind of when the employees first started arriving. I call those the first employees because they were technically the first people that worked at the plant. So, it's a really nice picture. Where's Patrick? Patrick, you need to take note of this picture right here. This is James F. Bryant. He is the first employee to be hired from the Kansas City area. What he's doing right there is jig welding. He's welding the first jig, and that jig is old number 1, and that's the center section jig, which was the first thing that they built at the plant. He was hired on July 8th. So he was the first Kansas employee that actually started going to work. So while we're talking about that, of course, the majority of the women the majority of the bomber builders, I should say, that are here actually went, since they're women. We'll talk about the first women. January 19th, 1942, the first group of women were hired that weren't in secretarial or those kind of duties. So these were the first ones that worked out on the plant floor. They worked in the raw stock storeroom, which was this room right here. And here's the names of, since there's only 9 of them, I went ahead and put their names in there, and they all worked for Department 16. Anybody remember any of them? Probably not. A year later, all but one of them still worked there, and 3 of them were supervisors at the plant, which is pretty impressive. So I mentioned earlier that they were going to assemble plants. So when they first were building the plant, they called it an assembly center. There was absolutely no plan on actually building B-25s. They were basically going to take parts and put them together. And they referred to the plant as a B-25C assembly center. Notice I said C. And that was actually in an article that was written by, in October, which was literally just a couple of months before the first plane came off of the assembly line. So basically what they did, the first part started arriving in late June of 1941. The first 100 kind of went like this. They had 3 planes that basically all they needed to be done is bolted together. The next group of planes needed a little more work. The next group of planes needed a little more work. So by the time you're getting through that first 100, you actually had to start building planes yourself. And all of those parts came from Inglewood. And actually the hardest part, based on the accounts that I've had from bomber builders, was actually fixing, since they were transported from California into Kansas City, the hardest problem was putting them back in the shape they were supposed to be in. So assembly starts, I don't have a firm date on it, but basically it looks like November of 1941. I've had a couple of different sources on that one, so I'll just tell you that one. Interestingly enough, a couple of months later when the first B-25 comes off, all of a sudden they're calling them B-25Ds. The interesting thing is the C and the D are exactly identical, with the exception of the C's were built in California, the D's were built in Kansas City, so that's how they distinguished them. There is no way, if you just see a picture of an aircraft, there's no way to distinguish between a C and a D unless you see the tail number. December 7th, 1941. How many people recognize that date? A couple. The interesting thing is this is a picture, obviously that's the plant in the background there. And that's the picture of people standing in line wanting to get a job on December 8th. It's really easy for me to go, hey, look at all these patriotic people, try and line it up just because of Pearl Harbor. Until you start looking at the picture, looking at the shadows and how low they are, you realize that this picture was taken in the morning. It was early morning. The speech by FDR didn't happen until later in the morning than this, about 11 o'clock our time. And so basically, some of these people probably didn't even know that the United States was attacked. The reason this line is like this, and it was like this just about every day, is because the average person in 1941 made about somewhere around 50 cents an hour. If you went through the National Defense Training School and were trained as a welder or something like that, you could make in excess of $1.40 an hour. People wanted to work here. So that's there probably is a few people in there that are, that are aware of it, but more than likely, most people are just there trying to get a job. Which brings us to the next month, December 23rd, 1941. We built our first aircraft. There she is right there in Miss Greater Kansas City. She was christened Miss Greater Kansas City by Mrs. Thomas Bender. Thomas Bender was the first employee that was hired for the assembly line portion. Remember that Mr. Bryant was the jig welder. But here she is actually christening the ship on the 21st. The original dedication was actually scheduled on January 10th. She was completed ahead of schedule. A lot of people say that the plant kind of lagged behind and couldn't really get geared up. That's not the case. They were building planes ahead of their schedule. This is her, actually January 3rd, 1942. That's when she had her first flight. And she was accepted by the United States Army Air Force on February 17th of 1942. She went to Wright-Patterson for a while and then La Junta and was scrapped in 1945. This is kind of an odd coincidence. You see that burning pile of rubble, unfortunately, is the first tragedy that happened at the plant. And as it just so happens, it happened to unlucky number 13. The 13th plane that was built was the first plane that actually crashed. She lost an engine on takeoff, didn't have enough airspeed to actually have controlled flight, and ended up crashing, and all 5 men on board died, unfortunately. That was the only loss of life crash that they had in their entire production run. A lot of people probably have seen this picture. It's pretty popular. They're yellow because they're actually coated with chromate. It's not paint. It's actually a rust inhibitor. This is early on. That's probably it's plane 100. So this is going to be probably about October of 1942-ish. So there's an interesting. Obviously, that's a B-29, and that was built in Wichita. And I bring this up because on February of 1942, so we're already starting to build B-25s. In February of 1942, we got a contract to build some B-29s. And almost immediately, they went from 200 to 300. They said, we really want you to build these B-29s because we think these are going to be great airplanes. As it turns out, they started planning. They did all they could. Remember February of 1942. And so they decided they're going to build the high bay. It's going to double the plant size. And that's going to allow us to build these big behemoths right next to the B-25s we're already building. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. So the final assembly in 43, 45, just to kind of, we'll do it this way. So the B-29 contract in February of 1942, what happens in April of 1942? Does anybody know? Doolittle Raid. So the U.S. government decided, you know what? We like these B-25s after all, so let's forget about these B-29s, and how about you double the amount of you're going to build? I need to stand back here, apparently. And so that's what they did. So they canceled the B-29 contract, and they went ahead and they started building even more B-25s. So more manufacturers started moving into the plant. Now the problem they had with this is their suppliers couldn't keep up with them. It wasn't that the plant was lagging behind, it's they couldn't get the parts from the other manufacturing places. So the solution was for them to build it themselves. So they actually they built the foundry, they started doing all their own manufacturing. They installed an overhead conveyor system. I've got some great pictures. This is kind of what the plant looked like. And you can tell the majority of the plant up here is actually sub-assembly work, and this is just where the final assembly work, so wherever the plans are put together. So the majority of the people that worked here probably worked up in this area. Anybody work in final assembly? No? Yeah, there wasn't a lot of people that worked there. This is the overhead conveyor system. It was actually really cool. I like this a lot because it's one of the reasons that they ended up winning an award for production was they were able to build sub-assemblies in one area and quickly and conveniently get them over to the other side in just the right time to put them all together. So much so that in January of 1945 they built 315 planes in 1 month. That's pretty impressive. 315 B-25s, that's a little over 10 a day. They were producing so many airplanes by 1945 that they were flying a lot of them straight into storage. They didn't need them. And they went through about 4 different workforce reductions that year. So to try to compensate for all of that, they got a contract to build this little aircraft here. It's a P-80 Shooting Star. It was the most advanced pursuit jet of the day. They didn't release any information on it because this was a top secret kind of thing. Now, although it never made it into combat, they were supposed to build them here in Kansas City. That contract was signed in March of 1945. So May of 1945, just a couple months later, VE Day, victory in Europe, so Germany surrenders. So guess what? We don't need these planes after all. All we have to do is concentrate on Japan, and we got this war won. So literally 2 weeks later, they canceled the P-80 contract. And with that was the first really large layoff of employees, which actually quite a few of you that I've talked to were laid off because of this contract layoff right here. So about 1,500 people were made available to other industries. I know Mary, for example, went to work for Arion, which was also down in Fairfax, which we've done a little bit of research on. I'll have to get with you on that. And then, of course, on August 15th, I'm going to kind of say this, there's 2 ways. There's 2 actually Japan surrender days. They announced the surrender on the 15th. This is a very important day because on August 15th, the ones that were lucky enough to make it through the first layoff, they walked into work on August 15th and were told to go home. We'll call you when we want you to come back, if we want you to come back, but go home. Obviously, the formal surrender wouldn't be until September 2nd, but on August 20th, they were given their official walking papers. So it was the largest layoff. They laid off basically about 6,000 employees and left about 2,000, a little over 2,000 or so there. The reason they did that was to basically tidy things up. So basically what happened, and I only know this because I know several people that relayed this to me, was there was a general that came in, pointed to an airplane and said, we'll take from here forward. And that's an important distinction. Many years ago, you'll see two different numbers used for the B-25s that were made here. One is 6,608, and the other one is 6,680. The difference is 72 aircraft. As it turns out, if you read the books, it says they accepted 6,608 airplanes and 72 that were incomplete but flyable. The distinction is in the phrase incomplete but flyable. So basically, the Army owns the weapons systems that are on there, basically all the machine guns, right? So those last 72 planes, General goes, point here, I'll take these planes. It turns out there were 72 of them. And every single one of those was completed, they just weren't armed. So they were incomplete based on the contract, because the contract required them to be armed. They were built. I give you guys credit for them because you guys built them. And I'm okay with that. The last of which was completed on October 15th, 1945. That's a group of people standing in front of the very last B-25. And she was flown to storage on October 31st, 1945. Now, interestingly enough, most of the planes that survive today are the later planes built in late 44, early 45. Not all of them. There's a fewer older ones. But let's talk about what the plant built for a second. It was in operation for 47 months, from November of 41 to October of 45. First guy hired is James Bryant. I love that picture. There were 59,337 employees that built 6,680 B-25s. It breaks down C's and D's like that. Basically, 2/3 of the B-25s that were built here. There was only 9,889 of them built. Almost 7,000 of those were built here. So you guys built the lion's share of them. So as it turns out, the Kansas City plant in Fairfax built more medium bombers than any other plant in the world during World War II. That's pretty impressive. Axis Nightmare is one of those that's still flying today, and that's a beautiful picture of her. So roughly, if you do the math, there's about 150 airframes that still exist around the world. 37 of them-ish are still flying, and all but 2 of those 37 were built here in Kansas City. There's only 2 aircraft, 2 B-25s out there that are still flying that was built from Inglewood. 130 out of the 150, there's only about 20-ish airframes built in Inglewood that still survive. So there's 7 more being restored to fly. This is a great time to mention Patrick, who's sitting. Where did Patrick go? Oh, he's back there. Patrick? Patrick. I'm saying hi to you, Patrick. Patrick actually owns a B-25. He actually owns a couple of B-25s that he's kind of trying to put one back together with. I haven't seen it fly yet, so I'm going to say try. Tuesday at 2. I'll be there. Patrick's my brother from another mother. I love him dearly, and he's done an awful lot for me in this organization, and we're trying to do that. He's actually restored Sandbar Mitchell. It was a B-25 that was crashed some time ago, to put it back in the air. And also we've got the Show Me crew that were nice enough to fly from St. Louis in, that's already back in the air. And actually floating around here somewhere are some crew members from the Fairfax Ghost. In the back is one, I see. Anyway, so these people do all of this for one reason. It's to honor the people that built them. And I appreciate that, because if we didn't keep them flying, then they'd be kind of hard to honor the ones that built it. So let's talk about the Fairfax Airport, how this all kind of winds down. November 5th, 1945, GM took over the plant. May 8th, 1987 was when General Motors actually stopped building cars. January 1st, 1989, during demolition, it was completely destroyed by a fire. So there's nothing remaining of the plant, unfortunately, today. A little bit of good news is, if you'll take a picture, take a look at the picture on the left over here. This is a picture of the employee gate. You guys should recognize it because it's the gate that you drove in every morning and drove out of every night. This is a picture of it a couple of years ago. It survived all the way through today. And if you want to see a picture of it nowadays, you'd have to go to my house. I actually have one of the fence post toppers with me back there. But the B-25 History Project was nice enough when the government actually took over that area. They made General Motors sell off that area. The company that bought this section we went to, and we asked nicely, and they said yes. So they gave us the employee gate, which we're currently restoring, and we'll do something with it in the future. We just don't have that figured out yet. But the reality of it is, that was the last thing that came off the grounds, and we were able to save and preserve that little piece of history. So we're pretty proud of that. That is a little bit about that. So basically, I'm going to go through this really quickly. This is us. Our mission is to preserve and honor the history of the B-25 bomber, the men and women who built, flew, and maintained them, past, present, and future. You can tell I've said that a time or two. We've got all sorts of things we've been doing. I'll get to this in a little bit. I've been doing this since 1989, when I was 3. That's me right there. I call myself a B-25 historian, but a few people will argue with me and say that I'm a plant historian. That works. I'm okay with that. Back in the day, we had a newsletter that we sent out, my grandparents and myself, that in its heyday went out to over 900 former employees. As you can tell by the fact that there's not 900 people here, there's obviously a few less. And every year there's a few less. We, personally, I run b25history.org, sorry. We also have Facebook, Twitter, and all that other kind of stuff that most of you in here probably, myself included, know very little about. That's my grandfather on the right. Go back to that for a second. It's my grandfather on the right. That's a picture of the memorial that sits out in Mayor McTaggart's museum out there in Wyandotte County. It was designed and built and dedicated, rather, in May of 1998. It's been sitting out there since. Also out at the museum is a vertical tail, and I don't know if any of you might, I think you signed it, didn't you, Eleanor? Did you sign the vertical tail? Yeah, I think you did. Back in the day, there's about 107 signatures on it. We had a reunion and we invited every person that built the plane to sign that. It's on permanent display out at the museum as well. So that's my 2-cent tour of the museum. So basically, we've got 150 pages, and I've got about 3,000 more to write. And I'll talk about a few of those in a second. Over 36,000 individual page hits a month. But let me tell you why I do this. There's a gentleman right there you might recognize. I love this picture of my grandfather, and I never noticed it until literally a year ago. This is what I call a 1942 selfie, because if you look carefully, you'll see his hand and you'll see a little string hanging up there. He had the camera on a tripod, and he was activating the shutter by himself. He's wearing his North American aviation shirt and his fall jacket. I know this was 1942 because that's when they started working there. He still had that jacket. Actually, I think it's probably in a box at your house. Anyway, that's my dad, by the way. Anyway, so he worked in Department 2, and oddly enough, where's he at? The other guy that I've got here, the other gentleman that worked here, there he is, he's way in the back. He worked in sheet metal too, and he worked on the presses and riveting and those kind of things that my grandfather also did. They probably don't know one another, unfortunately. This is my grandmother, my grandfather's wife. Obviously, she was an inspector number 457 to be exact. They used to call her Send-a-back Alice because she was pretty darn picky.